Okay, well, John Williams is my name. I'm a scientist who trained in agricultural science originally, but with an emphasis on hydrology and soil physics. I did that at Sydney back in the 60s, 68. I come from a rural background. I came off a sheep station not far from Captain's Flat, Bungendore, in some of the Tindri ranges, so I have a long association with land. My family are of Scottish origins, some 5 generations Australian, so I grew up in the 50s through the rabbit plagues, and so I saw enormous impact on the landscape. We were in this subterranean clover superphosphate revolution, so-called, which did lift productivity, but it left a trail of environmental issues behind it, which we're still working through. So I've always had a very strong interest in, from my father, and working with him on the land, trying to produce a product, food and fibre, wool, beef, and do it in a way that didn't do so much damage to the landscape. And that meant the land as well as the water. So that's where I've come from. Now I've been, I went overseas and you did all the normal postdoctoral studies in Canada and USA and UK. And then I wanted to do something in the developing world, so I took a role in establishing and working with some of the first appointments to the University of the South Pacific. So I did that, and I taught physics, and not very well actually, but environmental physics probably better. But yeah, and then I joined CSIRO, and I had 35 years with CSIRO. And then I was retired from that when I could see that the sort of organisation it was becoming was not something I really enjoyed being part of. So I retired, and then I was given the opportunity to work with the New South Wales government in policy framing for the Natural Resources Commission. I was a commissioner there for 6 years, 6 years. And then I just had an opportunity to join with Quinton in ANU. So I've been very blessed to be able to sort of gradually change from a full-time role in a big organisation to be able to choose to work in areas that I felt I could contribute as I got older. So that's me. Well, I'm currently based in Canberra, in the ACT. In some ways, since I came back to the home grounds, to the Southern Tablelands, where I grew up. I was born in the Alps of the Southern Alps of Australia at Tumbarumba. So, in a way of being away for a long time, in the last, I suppose the last 15, or even longer, I've come back to home territory. So I'm in the Southern Tablelands and Murray-Darling Basin again. That's where I grew up. Yeah, well, look, I've been interested in joining the Water Justice Hub because primarily I've been in water reform for a very long time, since the mid-90s. I suppose, when I became involved in it directly in the Murray-Darling Basin. Prior to that, I was involved in some of the water work on the Burdekin River, which is a large river in northern Queensland. And so water and so flows on from studying hydrology as a whole. But the thing over the years of water reform, so much of us had been talking about moving from water rights and from licences to water entitlements that had a legal entity and had a financial ownership. So I'd seen a huge change in the water reform. But so much of what we did in the water reform so far hasn't really faced up to the water justice issues. That is, what is, in terms of a society, what is the just outcome on how we use our water resources? up until now, so much of it has been driven primarily through the economic use of it, and to some extent a sort of stewardship interest in you don't want to destroy the hen that lays the golden egg. So you tend to say, well, we'll look after it, we'll take as much as we can, but we don't want to kill it, which is really not sufficient in terms of the considerations we need to apply to water. So a water justice research unit, to me, after all that experience in water reform, seemed to be, can we add some new insights and values to how we look at water? Because what we've done so far is proving, in my view, insufficient, because it's let a lot of people, particularly our Indigenous people, out of the question. It's let a lot of people who see water and landscapes as having a spiritual, healing, well-being role, not in the equations. And there's a whole lot of justice, access to water and land that largely hasn't been part of the dialogue, and I think it's well over time that it was. Well, I can focus on the things I know something about, and that is how the system works. And so to look at the hydrology and the river connection to the landscape, the groundwater, the estuaries and the oceans, to understand the system and how the flows are operating in that, and the impacts of what we do to the way those flows and functions and ecological functions are impacted. Understanding the system and our interactions on it, you then start to understand where are our interactions likely to have some impacts on the water justice story. And so my contribution to the hub will be to look at the issue of how it works and what are how are the impacts of human intervention on that water and the way we manage it impact on the social justice of water in our society. That's my part, I believe. Well, my feeling is very strongly that the issue is to bring into the discussion the Indigenous rights to water, the fact that their sovereignty has never been properly ratified. I think Indigenous values of water are part of the issue that is most important. It's not a field that I, as a non-Indigenous person, can speak to in terms of its meaning, but I'm very conscious of that work. But I see it as a European origin heritage, that we have failed in our heritage to see water in its values in terms of its emotional, spiritual and well-being values, and building that into the way we use it in a formal way. And also I think in our way we have not seen the river and the groundwater systems and the estuaries as living things. We've seen them as assemblages of bits and pieces and flows of matter, but we haven't seen them as an entity that has some rights and functions in its own right. So that to me is an important insight that we want to bring. How does society manage its water resources, knowing that that body that you're managing, that river system and its groundwater, its estuaries, is a living entity and has perhaps rights in its own way? And that's why I'm attracted to some of the new work that Anna Polona has done on recognising that right in some of her recent papers, which you will know well. So that's to me the issue that I'm most interested in. People like Anna Polona and also Sue Jackson, who's an affiliate with us but is not in the primary group, But that work is important, and Kat's work with Anne is a work that I find most interesting. How can we restructure the discussion on how we understand water and its values and its meaning, and how do you bring that into the equation with some of the work that Anna's doing on valuation. Yeah, I think that's a helpful question, because one of the things I guess I'd love our community as a whole to be better informed in this area of water is to understand the system that the water is part of, to understand the hydrological system, the river, the groundwater connections, the flows backwards and forwards, the connections to estuary and the connections to the ocean, and understand that all along that flow path is important ecological functions, and there's no such thing as water is wasted. It is doing something. It's creating value in terms of ecological, hydrological and geomorphic functions all the way down through the system, and it is a system. And I just think when I often drive around suburbs and seeing, don't worry, I'm just using bore water. Little do they realise that that's just water that's in the system and they're getting it before the river gets it, maybe. And to understand that if people say, well, why don't we save this water that we're irrigating with? Well, what are you going to say? What's that water doing before you saved it? It was probably flowing past the root zone and maybe going into a groundwater system that someone downstream was subsequently using. It may well have also been going past the groundwater, taking salt with it and salinising a wetland. So you needed to know what that was doing. And so understanding where the water flows is and what it's doing and how and looking at the whole system rather than just a little piece. Like understanding that a dam doesn't create water. All it does is help us redistribute. It doesn't make more water. And so our political agenda so often is we'll put more dams in and that'll fix the water problem, without realising that it doesn't do a thing to the water problem except make it more complex in most cases, and you trade one value and function off for another in the system. But when you understand things are connected and that water flows into the ground system, into the groundwater, and into the river, and out of the river into the groundwater, backwards and forwards. The Murrumbidgee, between Canberra and Gundagai, and then further on, the number of times the river feeds the landscape and the landscape feeds the river is multiple, hundreds of times as you go through the system, depending on the geomorphic setting and the permeability and the slopes and gradients of the landscape river interface. So that's what I'd like to help us as a society to see the system. Well, Quinton and I have a long research association going back to about a long time, early days when we were together in the Wentworth group. So that goes back to 2005 or 2002. So Quinton Grafton and I have a long common interest in mine in hydrology and he's in water economics, but there's a lot of crossover. And so when it was a possibility to put together a submission for a laureate, I helped in not a very major way, in a minor way, of trying to construct the water justice hub concept in the actual laureate application. And I guess I joined it because what could I contribute? I'm not trying to do the frontline work at my age. I'm 78 years of age. So what I could do though, because many of the people coming into the hub were younger people with excellent brains and excellent concepts. So what I could be is probably a bit of a mentor or someone who can assist the young come across in the hub and give it some at least experience that I've had, and enrich it and support the younger people. Well, I think in terms of pioneering the future, I think some of the work that Anne Paluma is doing and Sue Jackson, to me, this area of trying to explore the multiple meanings of water and values of water, particularly to our Indigenous people, but also to the broader sense of our spirituality and our well-being as human beings. That work, to me, I really do admire. I also admire, and naturally I admire the courage that Quinton and others and Matt and others that I've written with, who are prepared to speak the truth to power. I think that's terribly, terribly important. Not in an arrogant sense that we hold all truth in our hand. We don't. The best you can do is speak it as you know it and lay it out. And I think to do that, to recognise there are lots of vested interests and opportunities to capture the agenda, and I value those people. Jamie Piddock is another one, and before him were people like Peter Cullen, who I worked with strongly, who's done some excellent hydrology. Also, people who I worked with in CSIRO who have long since moved away. Some of Brian Walker's work on understanding resilience thinking. There's a lot of people in that area, and also that I very much admire. There's a lot of good work being done, and but I think the thing in water that we have to do, it's a complex world, and being able to speak as we know the science is, and speak to it to power and with effect, bridge that gap between the scientific understanding and the development of policy which reflects the very best science we know. That's not an easy field, but it is a terribly, terribly important field. It's a field that I've always tried to be part of when I was in CSIRO, as well as when I had the chance as Commissioner. It's a very important area. It's an area that is, as Peter Cullen's writing would indicate, it can be a minefield, because there's all sorts of powerful groups who wish to capture the science and tweak it to suit the particular agenda with which they have comfort. And you've got to watch that all the time and try and put in place mechanisms that means your science is spoken cleanly and openly without prejudice. So people who can do that, I admire. Well, okay, in terms of the Water Justice Hub, it's early days and we've had some good meetings. And I suppose in terms of the time since the Water Justice Hub's function, being able to travel to Wilcannia with the team and seeing Dan's work and the interface with the community, and to see the Indigenous people who contributed to that encounter at Wilcannia, to see that on the face of some of the young kids, a sense of admiration to their grandparents who were able to make stands and say what water meant in the River Darling to them, and to see those elders valued, and to see a sense that perhaps someone was listening to them. I feel that was very rich and very important, and that's in the recent times. Probably in my longer history, what do I have a favourite memory of? I suppose as when I was working with the Red River Gum forest industries to transform them into other uses, as well as the national parks, and we maintained and developed the national park principles for the Red River Gums of the Murray Valley. That was a hugely important piece of work in my life, but to see and be able to sit with our Indigenous people and understand that strong linkage between country, water, and the policy that you could develop to get some ownership of the management of some of those forests in the hands of the Indigenous people. They were pretty important steps forward to me. Yeah, well, in the future, there's two areas that I want to complete. I want to get to understand the hydrological operation of the Fitzroy system in Western Australia. A lot of people have contributed to that, but I want to bring that together in a way that helps us understand how that system works. It's very different to the Murray-Darling or to the Burdekin that I've worked in the past in detail. And I wanted to contribute to providing that understanding in languages and forms that can help the Murrawarra people in their journey of finding a catchment management governance process that will help us live and manage the Fitzroy in ways that avoid all the issues that we've had in the Murray-Darling. And that to me is a primary function. The other function I'd like to do is to sort of capture some of the work we did with the Red Gums and Indigenous people to form Indigenous protected areas at Werri, just up from Deniliquin, to see how we might move forward, where in the past land and water for any of the Indigenous protected areas have been quite clearly separated. Land has been fine to some extent, but access to water to manage these forests in ways that would return value in terms of multiple uses, including tourism and walking and understanding, as well as probably raising timber for special purposes. I think that's something that I would like to finalise. That's work I started but never was able to complete in is writing that up. And of course there's the work to understand how the Northern Murray-Darling Basin works in terms of the issue of floodplain harvesting. I'd love to see us get to the stage where we first of all recognise the extent to which it's going on, the impact it's having on the Darling-Barwon flows, and to work towards finding better solutions for its licensing and its management in ways that continue to keep the Darling running, and to challenge very seriously the perceptions that's being pressed in some quarters to disconnect the Northern Basin from the Southern Basin by saying we can service Broken Hill well with a pipeline from Wentworth. Meanwhile, the flows into the Darling don't matter that much, therefore, and we can capture them on the floodplains of the tributaries. I think, to me, we've got some major issues to resolve in the way we manage the summer rainfall Northern Basin that have been laying there under the carpet, and they need to be pulled out and dealt with in a transparent and just way.